Welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast, a weekly show featuring B2B sales leaders and executives. Hosted by five-time CRO John McMahon and Force Management co-founder John Kaplan, the show takes guests in the barrel, behind the scenes with the people who've been there, done that, and seen the results. Revenue Builders covers best practices for scaling and growing your business while sharing the pitfalls to avoid. Enjoy today's episode. Today, we revisit our conversation with Chris Degnan, former CRO of Snowflake. Degnan led that revenue engine through its incredible trajectory. John McMahon and John Kaplan talked with Chris when he was still CRO, and they explore the remarkable journey of building one of tech's most successful cloud data warehouses from the ground up. Chris takes listeners behind the scenes of his early days, ultimately helping transform Snowflake into a company that generated more than $1 billion in revenue. He reveals the mindset, coachability, and relentless work ethic that separates founders who scale from those who plateau.
Hello and welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast. I'm John McMahon and I'm here with the big man, Johnny Kaplan. Cap, say hello today. How are you?
How you doing, brother? Good to see you.
Good. Hey, Cap, our special guest today grew up in the same town that I live in, Sudbury, Massachusetts. And Chris went to the University of Delaware, started his career in enterprise sales at Informatica, and then he moved on to Covalent Technologies, which was acquired by VMware. From there, Chris became the VP of the West at EMC, and then he moved on to be the VP of the West at Avexa before joining Snowflake. Get ready for this, Cap. 2 years before they had a product. 2 years.
Yeah.
Chris is now the CRO at Snowflake, and he's helped build the company from zero to well over $1 billion in consumption revenues. Cap, please help me welcome my friend and the extremely talented Chris Degnan.
Hey, Chris, how are you? Thanks for joining us today. Congratulations on your outstanding success, and we're really looking forward to talking today. Thanks for coming.
Well, I'm honored to be here, and you know, part of the success I've had at Snowflake is due to Mr. McMahon. So I owe John anything he wants me to do, I'll do it. So I'm psyched to be doing it. So
it's awful nice of you, Chris. Awful nice of you. But I didn't do all the hard work that you did. So, hey, Chris, let's jump into this, right? And let's start with the fact that many people in our audience believe they want to be in a startup, and some even think they want to be in a raw startup. And then you joined Snowflake 2 years before, the first general availability release. Now that, to me, that's raw. At that time, looking back, joining Snowflake was a grand slam home run. But at the time, joining a company like Snowflake was a tremendous gamble. So tell us a little bit about what made you decide to take the leap.
yeah, so when I I think I got introduction to the quote unquote Blade Logic Mafia by working for Andy Byron at Avexa, and I got an opportunity to meet you, John, through Avexa. And it was actually I couldn't have been, my career at EMC was really helpful in what I did here at Snowflake, but my career at even though it was a short tenure at Avexa, it was incredibly helpful because there were things that I would have to always ask permission to do at EMC, and Andy would always be like, just go do it, dude. Like, I don't need to micromanage you. And so I learned both of those two things were really critical. And I think, when I started to pick my head up is I was back at EMC because Avexa got acquired by EMC, and that was the last place I wanted to be. I just was done with storage, and I just didn't like it. So I was like, and by the way, I had a great run there, but I just was done. And so I started to talk to a bunch of different people, some of which are, part of the Blade Logic Mafia. And, candidly, they were trying to imitate you, John. And I don't think there's a way to imitate John McMahon. John McMahon is an original, and you can't, imitate John. And so I think from my standpoint, I didn't want to go work for a pretend person or someone who thought they were better than everybody else. I really just was looking to work with good people. There's maybe a midlife crisis involved in there. It's just turning 40, and I met Mike Spicer from Sutter Hill, and Mike I mean, you know him so well. He's an incredible recruiter. And
Great sales guy.
He's a great sales guy, and I think he overpromised a little bit of what Snowflake, where Snowflake was, and I remember walking in, to my interview at Snowflake to meet the founders, and I was wearing a suit, and they were all wearing, ripped jeans and t-shirts and sandals, and I think they're all like, "What the hell is this guy doing here?" But I think it was just a combination of, I didn't want to go work for some people that were gonna think they were the next John McMahon, and I also think I really liked the founders, and I liked Spicer, and I figured, hey, I'll take this job. That, John, one of the secrets that I'm not sure you know is they when Spicer was negotiating with me on the job, I said the one challenge I have with taking this job is that there's no one that cares about me, that on the at the company, that there wasn't a CEO at the time. Mike Spicer was the CEO, and I said, so I really would like an advisor on the board, and I said, if you can help me solve that, and I said, at Avexa, we had John McMahon, and John was really helpful there. And so Spicer's like, well, I know John. And I think like that day, the next day or the next couple of days, you had a board meeting with him. And so he said, I have this company, I'd like you to, I mean, it was early for you too, right? And he asked you to join the board, and he came back and said, I got McMahon on the board. So I think you were the kind of linchpin to make me finally take the job, even though you may not know that.
I knew part of that, but I thought you might have already committed to it. And so Spicer, we met in a cafe in Redwood City, and he said, hey, I really like what you say when you're on the board, some of the comments that you make, and I really believe in, the way in which you approach sales. And I'm starting this company called Snowflake, and I'd like you to, help, join the board. And I said, well, what does it do? And now you got to remember, what was that? How many years ago was that?
2000. That was 2013. 2013.
2013. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, it's a cloud data warehouse. And I remember I got little tingles in my forearms, and that never happens to me. And he said, let me tell you more about it. And I said, you can tell me more about it, but I'm in. It was that short of a conversation. Yeah. So
it kind of, both of us, made it a little bit because Spicer was such a good, we believed in Mike so much, and it's for both of us, it's been a good ride.
You join the company, you walk in, there's no product. I think if I remember right, in that little room up in
San Mateo.
San Mateo,
Yep.
You walk in, there's like 10 developers in the background, and there's no sales guys, and it's you. In those situations, for somebody that joins a raw startup, what is it that you actually have to do, and what is your real job responsibility at that point?
The first thing I did, like the first couple of days, I was like, this is the biggest mistake of my life, as I'm sitting there staring across from I actually sat across from the QA team. So the QA engineers, and they're super nice people, but yeah, that was what I was going on, who I was looking at. And every time I pick up the phone, they're like, will you shut up? Because they were like doing their work, right? So I'd have to step outside and walk around. And I think I was struggling on exactly what I was supposed to do. And Mike Spicer, really all he cared about was making sure that we got customer feedback. So what I started to do was say, all right, at Avexa, at EMC, I would hold my sales team accountable to go on 8 sales calls a week, 2 to 3 net new business meetings. And so that's what I said I'll do. And so I decided, all right, I'm just going to go out. And even though I couldn't put the name of the company on my LinkedIn, I had nothing I could send people. I just started, creating spam lists and marketing to a bunch of, chief data officers, CTOs, and saying, look, we've built a database from scratch, and I had a whole spiel, and then I'd ask for 15 minutes, and I would go on 8 calls a week, and it was all new business meetings for a long time. And John, you were on some of the emails because every week, not only did I do the 8 meetings a week, but I would actually have to send to the entire company, including the board, the summary of my week's activity. And so I really was nervous that I was so afraid of failure that I would make sure I would do that. And I would send, a weekly update to the entire team. And to this day, even though we have a retention policy of getting rid of emails, that are older than a year, some of the founding engineers, they archive those emails and they kind of hold them as treasure troves, because it's a neat thing to go back in time and look back at some of the first meetings I've had with some of our earliest customers, and it's all there in the emails.
So if we really said in that stage, what is your real job? Your job responsibilities, making those 8 calls, getting exposure to potential customers, but you, in a funny way, you're a product manager.
The early engineers, they jokingly would call me the shadow CTO. Even though they tried to get me to write SQL and I failed miserably, they were polite about it, but to this day, I can't write a single code and whatever. But what it was the foundation of our kind of philosophy of put our customers first. And so instead of me, making a decision, which I tried to, force our founders to do many things, like go on premise, because I would get large enterprises interested and they say, when are you going to the private cloud? And our founders would say, never. So I would have to change my strategy on who our ideal customer profile would be. But nonetheless, I would bring them to meetings and they would make really very strategic product decisions on which way the engineering department was going to do. And all they really wanted to do was solve technical problems for the customers. And that's really how we started the company, from a customer interaction perspective. And candidly, to this day, that's still in our DNA and our culture.
Right. Now, Chris, so you're essentially a product manager, or as they politely called you, the shadow CTO. Then how did you know when it's okay to actually sell the product and actually bring in some sort of revenue?
Well, so we found like the first 2 customers, it turns out, and you know this well, John, is I think you were kind of still on the fence of whether or not we were going to work, because the only people that I could get to use the product were like ad tech companies and online gaming companies, if you recall.
Tech and ad tech, I remember that.
Yeah. And so so we got what we started to see was we had 2 customers, Accordant Media and White Ops, who were using the product on a daily basis, and they were using it to the point where it was starting to cost us money. So prior to Bob Muglia, our first real CEO, I invented a really awful pricing scheme that we ended up having to unwind. But so I went and pitched both Accordant and White Ops, and I said, okay, great. Will you sign this? And I don't even think they knew what they were signing. But they said yes. And so I think in probably June of 2014, I think we got our first 2 contracts, and I think Bob was starting right around there, and he's like, I'm not going to disrupt that. We got them to agree to pay us money, but then we couldn't bill them until probably the fall of 2014. So it took us another probably 4 or 5 months to figure out how to bill them. But that was another awesome experience. In fact, we have our 10-year anniversary. We've just had our 10-year anniversary, and I'm interviewing Tamara Hassan, who's now the CEO. He was the founder of White Ops, and now it's called Human. And to have that still connection where there's still a customer, and I'm talking to the guy who bet on us early on is neat. So
that's a great story. So if we walk through it, you're a product manager. Now you're starting to get a couple deals, and then if I remember, now we said, okay, let's go hire 1 or 2 salespeople, which you did. What would you call that phase of the company? So first it's like product market fit. It's, you're a product manager or shadow CTO. Then you're starting to sell a couple copies of the software. And now you're hiring a couple salespeople to see if we can expand our reach a little bit. What would you call that phase of the company?
I joined is probably in alpha, and probably it was the beta phase of the saying, do we really have product market fit? I mean, John, you've been involved. I've been involved in other startups where they can't find product fit for years, and it was taking a little bit of understanding that. But I think what I started to see was demand, like that we actually knew what our ideal customer profile was, and I think that was when I think you as the board member, I think Bob as our CEO and Spicer were like, okay, we now see that we're starting to understand who our ideal customer is, and we can go target those people. And that was really helpful. And that's when we started to really, go after, targeting, end user customers that fit in that profile. And so I'd still say that was pre-GA, because we were about a year away from GA at that point. But it was just getting more validation, if you will, on our product, on the product market fit. And do we actually have is the dog hunting, as Bob used to say? And the dog was hunting. So that's really was helpful for us.
Yeah, and what a lot of people don't know is when you started all of this, you had some very formidable competitors. Amazon had a product called Redshift. They were probably the leading product in the cloud. And then you had, multi-billion-dollar companies like Teradata, which were on-premise companies, but were trying to make the move to the cloud. So here you are trying to gain product market fit, being basically an evangelist out there, and everywhere you go, people are trying to compare you to Teradata and what they will probably do in the cloud, and to Amazon, a multi-billion-dollar company with the leading product in the cloud. Can you talk to us a little bit about fighting some of those, major competitors that way?
It's daunting, and I think, there's kind of two sides of this. Is number one is, when you're selling a startup product, people aren't going to give you a ton of money to start. And I think, there's a misperception if you're a salesperson that you can go into an early stage startup and make a ton of money. And I will tell you that my wife was pretty pissed at me for 2 years because I had no commissions coming in, right? I took a pretty big pay cut for probably 2.5 years, 3 years before I could actually make any money, because we really weren't selling enough to warrant me taking a commission check. And I think so first of all, that was a kind of a hard grind, if you will, to start off, doing that. And then competing against, the likes of Amazon and Teradata, and, there was a series of things that happened that, I always say I'm, better lucky than good. There's a lot of luck that I kind of ran into in my career at Snowflake. And the first set of things that was helpful is that Amazon, while they were the first cloud data warehouse with Amazon Redshift, it was not a good product. And so we actually solved a lot of the problems. So what I would do is I would actually build lists and focus on the people that were using Amazon. That was, first of all, I wasn't, at the time we would go after the large Teradata customers, but Teradata was the Ferrari of the data warehousing industry. And it was going to be hard for me to really go and take a huge Teradata at the time, because we were so small. So I focused on Amazon customers and Amazon Redshift customers, and we would spam them. And I identified the pains they had. So I would go in and say, not just me, the entire sales team, we'd go in and say, okay, these are the 5 or 10 things that you have pain around Redshift. And they'd say, yeah. And I'd say, we solve all these. And I'm like, don't believe a thing I say, try it, and we'll let you try it for free. So it was like just getting people to try and put data inside of Snowflake was incredibly hard. But we would get there and they would try it and they're like, oh, wow, this does solve these problems. So really the first luck, if you will, that I ran into was that Amazon Redshift was not a good product. And then secondarily, as we started to move, into the more enterprise-y sale, it was really IBM had this wonderful product called IBM Netezza that was a separate company, and IBM made the the wonderful decision to end of life Netezza, which pissed off all of their customers. So we started targeting Netezza customers, and it was really the Teradata was the last thing. And I think Teradata, and it's a good lesson for large companies, is Teradata was almost arrogant. They're like, Vertica has come along, Netezza's come along. No one's been ever able to replace Teradata. And they were kind of like, we're good. And they ignored the cloud, and they were really like, hey, the cloud's here, but it's way more expensive to store data in the cloud. And they ignored it. So they kind of let the cloud sideswipe them. And then we were there for our customers to help them move to the cloud. And that's awesome, because Teradata, sat on their laurels and they didn't respect the competition, and they got crushed, and they're getting crushed still.
Yeah, and then Chris, every company that's a raw startup has one customer that they can look back on that says, I got this customer. They busted our ass product-wise, but when we look back, that was the company that actually made us. And you can name who that company is, and maybe talk a little bit about that.
I'll tell you exactly what it is. So there's a company in Boston called Localytics, and Localytics, they had one of the largest, they had a 500 plus terabyte Vertica cluster on Amazon. And we started to work with them, and their engineering team were really interested in us. But there was a technical issue where what you called cluster data was not how they wanted us to cluster it. So you'd have to recluster the data. That reclustering effort was probably a 7-month pivot for the entire engineering team. And it was probably one of the most expensive, database migrations in history, because we have, God only knows how many PhDs we had working on that database migration. But what that did was that led to us, getting them up and running. They actually forced us to institute a lot of feature sets. Then Nielsen, we were about to lose to a Hadoop vendor that's out of business. I actually.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, we were about to lose to them, and Thierry, our founder, was like, "Oh, just turn on this recluster feature." And Nielsen, all of a sudden, there was a bunch of Israeli engineers, and they're like, "You guys are cheating. What did you do?" Because because the work that we did for Localytics, all of a sudden it was like, "Oh yeah, we turned it on," and all of a sudden we were way faster than the open source tool sets and way cheaper. And I think those two things really were material, because then when Nielsen signed up with us, then Nike cold called Nielsen. And then Capital One, we lost Capital One to Redshift, only to get them back. And those were our first early customers that were in the enterprise space that really moved the needle for us.
I really am. I'm listening to these different stages, and before we get on to the sexy part of the scale and the execution that Chris is just dominant at, I want to talk about a little bit. We've talked about thus far kind of a couple of stages, Chris, a startup phase where you were kind of shadow CTO. And really what I think I heard you say was your responsibility was as much about gathering requirements and understanding what customers, what they're dealing with, what they're struggling with, and then bringing that back and being a great translator to your technical teams. And then you moved into this kind of, okay, we have an understanding of this where we now have some product fit and or some product viability. Now we're starting to identify, ideal customer profiles. I don't want this to get lost in the conversation. Couple of things that are amazing to me. Number one, that's typically different people. And it's very rarely that you go get a former grinder. I can't characterize you as former. You're a grinder today, like you were a grinder back in the early days. But it's really rare that you get somebody that comes from like a background that's at scale at EMC, and then or at Vexa or wherever, and then to be able to come back. Can you give us a couple of lenses for, let's say our audience, we're listening. What does it really take? A lot of people say, yeah, I can do that. I can go back, and Johnny and I laugh about it. We call it the laptop effect. When guys say they can go from scale and then they can go into these startup companies, and then they call us and they complain about, man, I didn't get my laptop, or they didn't get my 401k set up right or whatever. And Johnny and we're not laughing at them, but we're like, look, that was part of the discussion of what it really takes to go into these environments. So sorry I'm doing such a long setup on this, but I'd love our listeners to hear a couple of things. Number one, what was it in you, and what decisions would you make being honest with yourself that says, I can do this and I'm going to do it for these reasons? It's not going backwards, but it's going into a different environment that I'm in. And then number two, if you're the hiring manager, if you're an executive, if you're a board member, if you're an investor, what questions would you really ask somebody to say, are they, number one, capable of doing that? And number two, is it going to give them energy? Does it make sense?
It does. Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think and I think McMahon does an incredible job in interviewing people to find out their who they are as a human. And
yeah,
and just to share a personal bit of myself is that, I grew up initially, fairly well off, sitting at the front row of the Celtics games, and to having nothing, like having my house almost taken by the IRS, my parents going through this awful divorce, and a lot of other stuff. And people in general will say, that they can blame other things in their life for their failures. And, when I was young, because this was when I was probably 13, 14 years old, I said, I'm like, dude, I'm not going to let this define me. I'm not going to let that. So I think from my upbringing, I started riding my bike to Star Market in Sudbury, Massachusetts, to bag groceries, and then to go and get a better paying job. I became a cashier, and then I said, oh, I can be a bank teller at Bay Bank, like in Sudbury. So like, I just think I've had this mentality, and I have the mentality to this day, is you have to earn your keep every single day, and nothing is handed to you. And I think the biggest issue, candidly, of people that have come from big companies is that they have like I have now. I have everyone kind of doing everything for me. And I think, what I have, the biggest thing that kind of the thing that I worry about the most is fear of failure. And so, when I came to Snowflake, I wasn't the VP of sales, I was the director of sales. Yeah. And Mike Spicer told me I'd never be the VP of sales, let alone the CRO. And I've taken the mentality that I have to earn my job every day, every month, quarter, and I still keep that same philosophy. There's different things that you have to do as you become a big, as the company grew. And I think the other thing is, I think being super open to feedback is like, I don't know everything. And I'm going to, like, people are going to punch me in the mouth and tell me I'm screwing something up. And I'm going to be like, okay, I'm going to go fix that. And I think John would tell you, like, he'd be like, hey, buddy, you're going to, if you don't fix this, it's going to get fixed another way. And then I think John certainly was part of the board discussions where, Spicer was certainly pushing to replace me and bring in a more senior person, and I was fortunate to have Bob Muglia, support me to be the chief revenue officer. And even to this day, Bob jokes and says, as soon as Bob, moved on from Snowflake, he thought for certain Frank Slootman would fire me. So, look, I'm always afraid that someone's going to take something from me, and I'm always going to try to, do my best to grind and keep my job. And that's how I am as a human.
I've heard you say, very powerfully, I've heard you say, you believe that you have a 90-day employment contract is really how you view your job. And I want to hit you with something. I want you to contemplate it for a second. Most people that think that way, the good part of it is it's awesome that, you've had unbelievable success. The largest IPO in the history of technology it's just fantastic. but you now, with all the success, you still believe you have a 90-day employment contract. There's a saying that says you have to work as much on the business as in the business. And what I find with the grinders as they grow is, and they identify with the grinding piece, is sometimes they really struggle with working on the business. And that's probably why Spicer and some of those people, it's very rare that somebody will stay as a CRO or stay as the leader of sales through these different segments. How do you balance your comfort zone of the grinding in the business and the forecast and the number and the scale and the recruitment and all that stuff? And how do you balance it with working on the business now that it's a huge company?
Well, I'll give a ton of credit to Frank Slootman on helping me mentally get to this spot, because in a lot of ways, Snowflake, is my baby from the go-to-market standpoint. And I care very deeply about the company. And I'm very passionate about it. And I think, Frank noticed, and I think part of what made him keep me in the job was because I was so in the business. Like, I knew the customers, and the customers that I have to this day really good relationships. But I think, so he made this comment to me, and he said, "Chris, you're a deal hound." And he said, "That's great. And that got us to where, we needed to be, but it's not going to get us to where we want to go. And so you've got to hire people, and you've got to trust that they're going to do their job. And if you start doing their job for them, they don't belong here." And he talks about passengers and drivers. And he goes, "You're a driver, but you need to hire other drivers and hold them accountable." And so I think that's been the key. You never trust anyone 100%. But I think if you find yourself, especially at the scale we're at now, if I find myself that I'm doing someone else's job that works for me, then it's a problem for them.
You got a problem.
I'll do it,
Yeah.
but they don't. That's not going to end good for them. So
Right. Hey, I want to go back, Cap and Chris. So, having watched Chris through all these different phases, one, in the early days, he knew how to scrounge. You call him a grinder, but he knew how to scrounge.
Yeah.
But if you really say what Chris could do, because there was many discussions, as Chris pointed out, on whether or not he would make it. Chris had, one, he was very, very, very coachable. He really took to heart what you told him. But more importantly, he adapted, he changed, he morphed. You'd see him one quarter, and he knew he needed to be in another place on the next quarter, and all of a sudden, he was there. He morphed, he adapted. And not many people can continue to adapt, and it's usually because they get to a point where they're either not driven anymore, or they just stop being coachable. They think they know everything. And Chris has this wonderful ability to both be coachable and continue to adapt and morph. So I give him a lot of credit for that.
I love that.
I think I'll just say, John, it also goes to surrounding yourself with amazing people. I mean, having my MBA is, sitting down with John McMahon and building up productivity models and talking about that stuff, sitting down with Bob Muglia, with Frank Slootman, with Mike Spicer. I've been super fortunate to have people that, if I'm not listening to them, I'm an idiot, right? And you guys are all legends in my eyes. And I think that's part of the wonderful part of Snowflake is, taking advantage of these amazing leaders. So
Johnny, let me add another variation to that too. And I think our listeners have heard this on this podcast today with you here, Chris. My experience is the most successful people on the planet are the ones that have made sense of their own stories. And we've had Doug Holliday on the podcast where he talks about this very thing and like being comfortable in their own skin. and you've made a number of references here in the last 30 minutes of just talking to us. You talked about overcoming learning disabilities. You've talked about you and I share the family home getting taken away from us, and that's there's people that stuff like that, life happens to people, and they either can't make sense of the story or try to run away from the story, and there's other people that have things that happen to them in their lives, in professional and personal, and it's a part of their story. And it doesn't surprise me that you've taken that, assessing what you can learn and being comfortable in your own skin, no matter where you come from. I just don't see it a lot today, Johnny. I see people that get to a certain level, and then when they're asked to do something that is perceived maybe at a lower level, but there's a good reason to do it because there's tons of growth, that people won't want to do it because how they would be perceived. It's like other people's eyes versus your own eyes. And that's how Johnny's always described me to you, Chris, is that you've been very, very comfortable in your own skin. When I read about the 90-day contract, I'm like, I get it, man. This dude is motivated by, he probably hates to lose more than he loves to win. And and that is a really, really, really cool attribute. So I just want hats off to you.
Yeah, I mean,
Hey, Chris, talk a little bit about when you knew. I mean, I think I know, but talk about when you knew, oh, I think the Snowflake thing's really going to go. It's really going to be a, sizable company.
because John, I think you and I talked about this. It's like, when we were just having these, and they were wonderful customers, and they are wonderful customers to this day, but the online gaming and tech companies, I can't just sell to them. And I think when Capital One leaned into us, and in a material way, I was like, okay, we got something. And it was a lot of work because they wanted us to do more engineering work and they actually forced us to change our philosophy as a company on how we were going to do things. And but that was just a material moment in time. And then what I think the headwind that we kind of the tailwind that we kind of took advantage of was the fact that I think we were surprised at how fast all these companies were going to move to the cloud. I think that still shocks me to this day. But I think the Capital One thing, okay, great. And then now it's that it's still going on, right? The tailwind of the cloud migration. So.
Yeah. What I want everyone to hear is there was a time when Chris and I actually talked about the fact, oh my God, can we only sell to tech and ad tech? Is this it? Like, this is all the company's going to be able to do? This is never going to be a big company. And then what Chris is talking about to the listeners is, then we had Capital One, and then you had this realization, wow, if we can get Capital One, we can get almost anybody on the earth. So here it goes.
But how would you guys describe that as being a little bit more purposeful now to say, okay, we've identified an ideal customer profile. That doesn't mean that it's in a segment. That doesn't mean that it's in an industry. So Chris, how would you go, if you're writing a book about that experience and you and Johnny talking about that, like what were the mechanics behind it? Was it, okay, we understand their problem's attached to a big business issue, therefore they're going to spend lots of money on it? Like, could you get into that a little bit more? Like when you said Capital One and when the problem started to scale, what mechanically did you do and what advice could you give about people that are in this state? They have some good users, some good companies, and they're trying to go after a larger addressable market. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think
talking about scaling, John, scale.
Yeah, but scaling around that fundamental question of, holy smokes, is there anybody else that can use this? And like, what did you do about that? Like, there was a fundamental question, and then you went out and did something, found out, yeah, there's a whole heck of a lot of people. So I'd like to know the mechanics of that a little bit more.
So there's kind of two sides of that, because I had a leader on the East and a leader on the West that were running almost very different businesses. And I'm a velocity guy, so I like velocity. I like transactions. Like, that is at the heart of it. I want new customer logos. The guy on the East, he got starry-eyed with, large enterprise, and he only wanted to sell the large enterprise. And I think, you can't do one or the other, you have to do both. And I think that's the lesson I learned is like, dude, the large enterprise is wonderful, but they'll surprise you in the upside one quarter, and they'll surprise you on the downside in a material way the next quarter. So if you build a business just on the large enterprise, you're screwed. And to this day, my largest market is in the West because we opened up the most amount of logos in the West. So that just getting new logos matters. And anyone who tells me they're just going to sell the large enterprise, as a salesperson, I would have zero interest in selling to just the large enterprise. I think what Capital One, the pain associated with Capital One is they had publicly made an announcement that they were going to vacate their data centers by a certain period of time. They didn't want to have any data centers, and they want to be they're an innovative company. They don't want to just be a financial company. They, in fact, they have a software product they built to integrate with Snowflake. So they're creating software company now. That's when we saw like, okay, like the competition can't help them vacate the data center, aka Teradata. Snowflake can. And that's when we started to say, wow, okay, now we actually have the first customer that's moved off of Teradata. Now let's go after every Teradata customer. And that was kind of like, go. And you felt that, and you're like, okay, that's when you kind of pivot and you're saying, okay, we were just selling to people already in the cloud. Now we're saying, okay, now we have a referenceable customer who's moved off of Teradata. Let's go after that. And that was really it. So
okay, so now the addressable marketplace just exploded, right? The size of the addressable marketplace. Now, Johnny, if you're comfortable taking the conversation into scale, some people do this. They're it's like at the buffet table, your eyes get a little bit bigger, and it's really the mechanics behind it is putting the right people in the right locations, in the doing the right things. And how do you balance it with not getting over your skis? So talk a little bit about that. Okay, market or addressable market just all of a sudden massively opens up, and now I can imagine the board members and everybody involved is saying, let's go, Chris, let's go get it, like it should have been yesterday. How did you scale it?
I mean, McMahon could tell you. So I very much built a commercial sales organization, high velocity sales. That is what I built. And I loved that business. And I clearly remember, we're remodeling our house, and I'm just living at my in-laws' house, and I get a text from John McMahon at 3 a.m, my West Coast time. He's up at 6 a.m. and he says, hey, call me when you get up. And I'm like, of course, when I get that text message, I'm thinking, oh, I'm getting fired. Like, I don't know what's going on, but I'm like, I'm in trouble. And so at 6 a.m. my time, I call, John, and he says, you got a new boss. You got a new boss, and it's Frank Slootman. And I'm like, oh my God. And so we go through all that transition. And the first thing that Frank said was, dude, you can't sell to the large enterprise the same way you're selling to the small medium business. It's just not, that doesn't work. And so within 3 to 4 months, we ripped the Band-Aid off, and I reorganized in the middle of a fiscal year, reorganized the sales team to be more deliberate about how we went after the large enterprise. And that took, we screwed it up the first time, and that's now matured into kind of what we call our vertical sales. But I think you kind of always have to evaluate what's working and what's not. And so, I went from creating a majors organization to now having a vertical sales motion in the large enterprise, and that's working really, really, really well. And so I think where again Frank was really helpful was helping me understand how to scale. And to McMahon's point, I wasn't married to any one thing. I was like, okay, if you say so and you think this is the right thing, I'll do it. And that's kind of the growth that I had to go through, was saying, because what worked before doesn't mean it's going to work forever. And there's still the velocity business that's super strategic and important because market share matters, but getting the large enterprise matters in a material way. And now we're rolling that out globally as well.
So Johnny, what an incredible inflection point. So you've got this relationship with Chris. He's got the right attitude. He's adaptable. He is all these things. That was your word. Now you're calling him and saying, "Hey, you got a new boss," without giving away the secrets around the kitchen table. I imagine people want to come in, and this is the sometimes the mistake people make. We got to go find somebody. Chris was great up to this point, but we got to go find somebody that really knows how to scale and do all the things that Chris just explained that he did, but he had the opportunity because he is adaptable. He's a great learner. He's a great execution. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how sometimes people make mistakes and just they'll throw away all this great experience that Chris has to go try to find somebody and then bring them into a culture, and then talk a little bit about some of the thinking about that, because I hear that every single day.
I think Chris said it. I mean, he wasn't married to any one idea. He was going to listen to what people had to say, and if they thought that they knew better than he was willing to go out and try it and see if it worked. And that's going back to his coachability and his adaptability. You got to give him a lot of credit for that.
How do you balance it, Johnny? How do you balance it? I love that. I understand what
ideas. You have to constantly be what I call a student of the game. You got to figure out, is this game changing?
But dude,
you're
sitting on the board. You're sitting on the board. We understand what Chris's attributes are of like, hey, I'm a great learner. I've proved that I'm adaptable. I got a 90-day mentality, and I've also proven that I can be strategic as well. Somebody comes in, they're like, yeah, I'm going to bring in my own team. Like, you're a board member.
That does happen. But so you got to give Frank a lot of credit for giving Chris an opportunity to prove himself.
Yeah. So first, figure out what you got, what's in the kitchen, before you just bring something new, because I see people make these mistakes, man. They don't understand the culture that you're going into. They don't understand what was built and how it was built. They're the pressure to, and just listen up as you're out there thinking about bringing people into your company. Like, I have seen people that have gone and even done the job somewhere else, and they want to bring that mentality because they've done it somewhere else. Doesn't mean that you're going to be successful in the environment that you're going into. So hats off to you guys, Johnny and Chris and Sloopman and everybody, for figuring out what was in the kitchen first before you decided to remodel. That's pretty powerful.
Let's talk about something else Chris had to adapt to.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what everybody else is trying to move to, but Chris has already moved to it. It's a consumption model where he pays his salespeople based upon consumption. So, Chris, can you talk a little bit about the challenges of, selling and then trying to generate, consumption with your customer base?
Yeah, look, first of all, having a world-class product, it makes life a lot easier. So first of all, if you're selling something that don't work, it's not gonna, the dog don't hunt. But I think
that also goes back to what you were saying before. When Chris originally was telling people what his different feature capabilities were, they were capabilities that the earth had never heard of before. So what he was talking about, for the audience, needs to understand that his customer or potential customer base was listening to Chris talk about those differentiators, and they were basically saying, yeah, okay, Chris, and pigs fly also, right? So that's why he had no choice but to prove it with the customers, because they just absolutely wouldn't believe it at that time.
Yeah. So that was like, that's like, don't believe anything I tell you. That's what I would say is, you might think I'm some salesperson selling you something that you don't need, but try it. And that we were fortunate enough to have a product that worked really well as we scaled the company. I think going through that process of the consumption model, of looking at how to sell, it's hard because especially if you say you're selling a seat-based license, or you're selling a piece of hardware, you basically say, all right, great, you're committing to using 100,000 seats, or you're committed to using $10 million of storage that I sell you, and you can pay the sales rep immediately on that. Our model was very much a land and expand model. So the salesperson that was used to making $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 a year, they were going to fail, because they were going to expect to come in and be someone that could just do some big deal and high five everybody. But in the consumption model, you have to be a student of what you sell, because not only do you have to have the customer commit, which is what we call a booking, or it goes to our remaining performance obligation, RPO, or that we report to Wall Street, but you have to get the customer to consume it. And so we hold the sales team accountable. Now, there's plus and minuses to that. The sales team has a booking quota and they have a consumption quota. The consumption quota, it's there's good and bad to that, but ultimately, you can impact that by selling the customer education. You can impact them by introducing them to a partner. You can impact that by getting our professional services team engaged, but you own the customer contract. And to fully realize your commission on that deal, not only do you have to sell that customer on the booking, but you have to get the customer to use it. And I think the benefit is in the customer, because the customer is saying, okay, I have a business partner who actually is invested in making me successful, not just selling me a deal and leaving. And the
Right.
hit sales mentality won't work here. And there's pluses and minuses to that. I mean, there's definitely, I've worked with some wonderful, incredible salespeople that probably wouldn't be successful in a consumption model, because they don't want to be that invested in the customer. They want to get this strategic deal and then say, see you later and pay me. So
Even this last topic in this consumption model is, there's
Oh,
a whole
that's a
podcast
topic.
on that, and I'd love to have Chris come back and talk to us about that, because
happy to.
it's not if for SaaS companies, if it's when. And so anyways, let's talk a little bit about what we talked about. We began the conversation just talking about the early days of Snowflake, and Chris, basically having a position of, they called him the shadow CTO. And really that conversation summed up well for me, is there's different stages that companies go through, whether it's startup, foundation, scale, whatever you call it. Chris called it like product build. He called it GA. He called it understanding the ideal customer profile. We talked about how difficult it is, and at being honest with yourself and comfortable in your own skin, to really understand that there are different sales attributes and characteristics, not only for leaders, but sellers and companies, of what needs to happen in those stages. And I think, Chris did a great job of talking about how, why he's so successful. And it's because of didn't really matter what stage he was in. He wasn't married to any one stage. He was open to learning. So people that are out there that are listening, and you think that your place is here, or your ideal space is there, if you believe you've got more to learn and you have an adaptable and you're coachable personality, there's great opportunity to be had. You were described as a deal hound, but because you loved the art of the deal, and that was kind of your, the 90-day employment contract. But what you did was you surrounded yourself with people that did all aspects of the business, and you learned. And so I love that part of your story. We then moved into scale, and you talked about the addressable market and balancing new logos. And so you're clearly rooted in the velocity business. Your every part of your being is rooted in the velocity business, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like having that mentality of, I've seen people that you don't really understand that, and then they suck at getting new logos, and you're going to die as a company if you don't have a focus on new logos. And one of the most interesting part of your story, Chris, that I really love is that you made really, really smart, probably impatient people contemplate what they had in the refrigerator before they went out to dinner. And that was you were in the kitchen, and before they went out and remodeled the kitchen, or before they went out and decided they're going to go get something expensive meal, that, you were already in the refrigerator. And my hat's off to Johnny and you and Sloopman, and again, you being adaptable again, to learn and to grow, and look at what Snowflake has turned into. The last thing we talked about, which we could have talked forever about it, was the consumption model. And I love how you said it. You said it's not just getting a customer to commit. And so everybody listening here, if you're not doing it today, McMahon used to tell me, if you want the next job or you want to understand the next thing, go start doing it. And so the customer commit part is now, that's the table stakes. It's now about the customer consuming it. They got to use it. And the ultimate measure of value in the future is going to be the use of what you are providing. And so if you don't have a mentality of being intellectually curious about not only how somebody's going to procure something, but how they're going to use it and how it's going to impact, business implications, and that, and then your value is going to grow by the use of it. If you're not thinking that way today, you really should start to be thinking that way. Johnny, what did I miss?
I don't think you missed anything. What I want to emphasize is how early on in companies, like when Chris thought, oh, we can only sell to tech and ad tech, or even the early days of PTC when we thought we can only sell to consumer electronics and medical device manufacturers. What happens today is so many companies want to go out there and think they can sell their product to everybody. And then what happens is they put a lot of salespeople on the street, they burn a lot of money while they're still trying to develop their product. And maybe someday the company will sell to all the different companies on the earth. But in the early stages, you got to figure out where your product fits, go down those bowling alleys and continue to make money in those bowling alleys while you're developing your product. So then you can take it into other aspects or other use cases and other bowling alleys. So I can't emphasize that more. I see it so many times where companies want to go so fast, especially these days where they're taking rounds of $200, $300, $400 million, and then they just throw salespeople at the problem and burn so much money when the product's not ready, or maybe it is ready. It's only ready for a couple bowling alleys.
When they're not honest with themselves about outliers. So once you establish that ideal customer profile, it doesn't mean it's ideal forever. It means it's ideal right now for the performance and the scale of the company for right now. And then, somebody will argue with you, in the major accounts group, Chris, or one of the verticals, and they'll say, well, see, we've got XYZ company and they're using our product. But if they're outside of your ideal customer profile, then you have to be honest with yourself and say that they're an outlier. It doesn't mean that there's not more behind them, but I've seen companies get killed by outliers, Johnny. It's a huge customer, and they start to try to pivot towards this huge customer away from their ideal customer profile, and they get into a problem. Again, that's probably a whole nother podcast. Johnny, take us on some rapid fires, will you?
Little rapid fire, Chris. You ready?
Yeah.
How about your ideal day off of work?
Well, right now it's where I'm at. Hanging with my family, getting on the boat in Lake Tahoe. I mean, I love this place. So that's it. Hanging with my family in Tahoe.
You're gonna pull the kids around on the jet skis or on the wakeboard?
Well, now it's wake surfing. It's wake surfing now.
Wake surfing, love that. Can you do it? Are you good?
Yeah, and it's not hard on your body. So
right.
Yeah.
What do you got? The Mastercraft?
A Cobalt surf. Yeah.
Cobalt, nice.
Yeah.
And does it automatically fill up the ballast? Or
you press. Yes, it has these buttons that you press, and this is my first boat I've ever owned.
It's unbelievable because years ago you had to basically fill them up, and once you did, and everybody wakeboarded or surfed, then somebody would say, "I want to ski." What do you mean you want to ski?
Settle down. Settle down. Right.
Dude, is there any water left out there in Tahoe? Is there still water?
Yeah,
all right. Okay.
Chris, what about your favorite meal?
My favorite meal is spaghetti and meatballs. That's what I grew up on. I love it. Pasta and meatballs.
Not SpaghettiOs. Not Kansas SpaghettiOs.
Not SpaghettiOs. Yeah.
You've graduated from the SpaghettiOs.
Yeah.
All right, good. How about your favorite movie?
It's not movies nowadays. It's shows, and and it's probably like one of the shows that I just loved was Breaking Bad. I mean, it took me a while to get into it, and then I got so addicted to it. So really
Yeah. Some of those TV streaming shows are unbelievable.
Yeah.
How about the best concert you ever been to?
Well, this is gonna sound really funny, but when I was in high school, I went to a Vanilla Ice concert, and I remember drinking when I wasn't supposed to, and walking out with two beautiful women right under my arm. So I felt pretty big time at this.
So it was the experience, not the concert so much.
For sure.
So, Chris, you know how much I, appreciate you being on. I always have loved working with you and to continue working with you. And I want to thank you so much for spending time with Johnny and I. Really appreciate it. And for our audience, they're going to get so many great lessons out of what you have to say. Thanks so much.
Well, John, as I said in the beginning, I wouldn't be in the position I am without you. And so I genuinely and from the bottom of my heart, thank you for investing in me. So I look.
You're welcome, buddy.
You're
welcome, buddy.
Yeah.
Hey, Chris, one of the things we forgot to ask you about, do you have a favorite charity before we wrap it up? Yes.
The Multiple Myeloma Foundation, it's cancer research. And, we have a family member that, that's affected by it. And, we contribute to that cause.
Awesome. So we'll get that in multiple myeloma. You'll get us a link to the website, and we'll make sure that we get that posted, and appreciate you for that. Brother, thank you so much for spending the time. There was so many golden nuggets, much respect for your career and what you've accomplished, and much more to come. So congratulations, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you both. Great
You got it, brother. And thank you for being on Revenue Builders.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoy the content, please subscribe, rate, and review the show to help us reach more people. This show is brought to you by Force Management, where we help companies improve sales performance, executing the growth strategy at the point of sale. Check out forcemanagement.com for more information.